and then build a heat-only boiler here in Ulaanbaatar to
Not
take
every
up
country in the world providing heat with, not necessarily with power stations.
No, very few in fact.
Yeah, and why would do that, this inefficient way of heating?
Well, it's not actually inefficient. Thermal efficiency of a combined heat and power plant is very high because not only are you generating electricity, you're also using the waste heat. So in terms of thermal efficiency, they are quite efficient. But, you know, most countries considered it too expensive to reticulate the hot water, to distribute the hot water. But here you have the reticulation system, and it's a case of building the capacity of that, which actually makes a lot of sense. It is cheaper to heat with the district heating scheme here in Ulaanbaatar than where, say, anywhere else in North America, for example.
Yes, but how about the air pollution that we have already from the power station number 4?
Well, the air pollution is an issue of how well the plant is designed and operated. And, you know, you can get very sophisticated electrostatic separators to remove the ash from the stack. So you will not get any ash or smoke coming from the power stations. In fact, if you go to Korea, and there are many coal-fired power stations in Korea, but you don't see any coal ash or smoke. And that is because they have more sophisticated power stations. You know, your power stations 2, 3, and 4 are actually quite old and don't have the level of technology which you would expect to see in
What would
power
be
station
the number
5.
5 technology?
We would expect that one to be right up to date. And
does World Bank work on that? Any feasibility?
Well, in the case of the World Bank at this point in time, we are not financing coal-fired power stations because of the greenhouse gas emissions issues. But certainly we would encourage the government to take, you know, to choose the best technology they can as one of the elements of reducing the air pollution in Ulaanbaatar.
Well, okay. Now let's talk about our mining problems. Of course, great developments are happening, a lot of money comes, but basically all money goes to the development of the mine. And through a few jobs, relatively, it creates some benefit for people. Our politicians is too much promising on that. And yet the government, for example, in case of Oyu Tolgoi, owns 34% of the business, which means they have to invest 34% of the required about $5-6 billion. What do you think? Is it the best practice? Why the government should own it?
Well, at the end of the day, you know, how much benefit flows to the government can be made up in many different ways, either through taxes of different types or through equity ownership. Equity ownership is an option, and you know, there are a number of countries around the world where the state does take equity positions in the operations. However, you know, there are both pluses and minuses to this process of taking up equity. The first is obviously the plus that if prices rise and profits are high, then the state gets a bigger share of the benefits of the operation. And I'm sure that's what's really motivating why the government has chosen to take this share. However, the downsides are that if it's not profitable, the government has to pay for that 34% and then could face losses into the future. The other issue around ownership relates to whether the government will maintain its independence as a regulator. Because when you're both an owner and a regulator, sometimes there is pressure on you to compromise your environmental standards, for example, in order to make more profits. And so the government may find itself in this conflict of interest position. Is it going to enforce a regulation and reduce the amount of profit, or is it going to go soft on the regulations and allow more profit so that the government gets more money? So this conflict is always going to be there.
And yet the government had decided to be always, even up to 51% in the strategic mines. And
yeah, well, this is the choice that the government has made, and I think provided that there is a clear separation of the regulatory functions from the ownership functions, then it can be done, but there's a risk. I guess when we look at some of the existing state-owned enterprises, very few of them are making substantial profits, and therefore, and some of them even the state is subsidizing into the future, which means that the citizens of Mongolia are actually paying to keep an operation running. This particularly is the case with most of the coal mines supplying your power system at the moment.
That's unfortunately with the subsidized price. People believe that they are getting cheaper power, but at the end it turned out to be very expensive, up to even blackout.
Well, that's right. At the end of the day, people are paying for it one way or another. A subsidy from the government means that there is less money to spend on other essential services. So, a subsidy for energy, for instance, might reduce the amount of money that they have for building schools and health centres or providing drugs to hospitals and so on. So there is never a free lunch, right? It has to be paid for somewhere.
Particularly when the government management system is not transparent, particularly according to our newspapers, a lot of sources are mismanaged, then we really have a problem on that, the subsidized price. I have certain questions to ask you about rehabilitation. And I understand there are better and best practices around the world. And I understand in Australia, for example, you will get back the mine site as it was before you dig it.
Well, not exactly. There certainly are best practices around the world, and countries which Mongolia could certainly learn a great deal from are Canada, the United States, and Australia, in terms of how to manage the development process of a mine and also to manage the closure process of a mine. At the end of the day, the objective of most of these closure and rehabilitation programs of the other mines is to create a sustainable environment past closure. Now that doesn't mean necessarily taking all the material and putting it back in the hole where the gold or copper was dug out from, but certainly creating an environment which can be revegetated, which can once again become a habitat for animals and so on, which is not releasing toxins into the environment through time. That is sustainable in time, is what is the objective.
How to make secure there is the fund for recovery, and secondly, what happens if that company, due to some reasons, bankrupt or something happens? What is the procedure to use that money?
Okay, well, what we consider to be best practice at this point in time is that when a company applies for a development license and submits its feasibility study, it should also submit a closure plan. And that closure plan should have with it an estimate of the total cost of meeting that closure. And what happens then is that as the mine is developed, the private sector operator places into a trust fund a certain amount each year, progressively increasing, so that eventually the amount of money that is in the fund equals the estimative cost to close the mine. Now, that money that's in that trust is